I think we'll go ahead and get started. People may be joining us as we progress here, but good afternoon and welcome to today's discussion on the Task Force on Eliminating Subminimum Wages and an update on the progress that they've made. This is a lunch and learn hosted by the Olmstead Implementation Office. My name is Leah, and I've been contracted to be a neutral facilitator in today's proceedings. I'm a middle-aged white woman with short brown hair, wearing glasses and a floral dress. I'm working in my home office with a picture of a flower behind me. So welcome everybody, and we can go to our next slide to start us off with some ground rules to help today's discussion be best for everybody here. So some ground rules as you join us, please stay present and give your full attention to this event. Please share about the topic for this event only, including in chat discussions. All participants are equal. Please raise your hand and wait to be called on by the facilitator to share. When you are called on, please introduce yourself and who you represent, if anyone, or just your perspective. And for accessibility, if you could please describe yourself and your surroundings. You can also share your preferred pronouns if you like. Keep an open mind. Be respectful of the process and other participants. And please do not share personal contact information for privacy. And just a reminder, today's meeting is being recorded. This meeting and other meetings will be emailed to you, and this meeting will be emailed to you, and other meetings will be available on the Olmstead Implementation website. A few other housekeeping issues to discuss with everybody. We do have CART and ASL services as part of this event. If you don't see captioning and would like to, click on the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. I think it says CC to show subtitles. And if you would like to pin the interpreter so that you can see that person throughout today's discussion, hover over their window with your mouse. Find the 3 ellipses or dots at the top right-hand corner of their screen and select pin so that you can see that person. Finally, if you do have clarifying questions to submit during today's presentation, please send those in the chat and we will take them as time allows, or at least have those for consideration after today's event. Right, we can go to the next slide then, please. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers to you. We have returning with us today, Andrea Zuber, the co-chair on the Task Force on Eliminating Subminimum Wage and the CEO of the ARC Minnesota. Also with us is Ryan Mers, the Employment Planning and Resource Coordinator at DHS Disability Services Division. So Andrea, over to you.
Great, thank you. Well, hello everybody. Once again, my name is Andrea Zuber, and I am co-chairing the Task Force on Eliminating Subminimum Wages along with Jillian Nelson. And I am also the CEO for the ARC Minnesota. I am a white woman with long blonde hair and blue eyes. I am wearing an orange and navy blue shirt, and I'm sitting in my living room in my home in St. Paul. So the goals for today's presentation are to provide an update on what the Task Force on Eliminating Subminimum Wages has done so far, and then also outline the work that the task force will do moving forward. Our agenda will be to review the purpose and the goals of the task force, just so that we have that level set for everybody. Talk about the work of the task force, our structure, the meetings, the research that's been conducted, the engagement activities, and then a little bit about what's ahead, and then we will close. So why are we here today? Again, I just want to recap in case you've missed any of the first of these 3 sessions that we've had this summer. So subminimum wage is the lowest amount, minimum wage is the lowest amount of money that somebody can be paid for doing a job. And sub means below the minimum. So subminimum wage is people being paid lower than minimum wage. And subminimum wage was created in 1938 because lawmakers did not believe that people with disabilities could earn competitive wages. The original thinking was that it was the only way for people with disabilities to have a job and gain work skills. And employers have to hold what's called a 14C certificate in order to pay people with disabilities subminimum wage. So there are 73 disability service provider organizations in Minnesota that pay subminimum wages. And between 4,500 and 6,000 people with disabilities are being paid subminimum wages in Minnesota. Minnesota has the highest rate per capita of people being paid subminimum wages of any state in our country. So in 2021, self-advocates in Minnesota proposed legislation to create a task force on eliminating subminimum wage. They brought the issue forward because of several reasons. The effectiveness of subminimum wage. There's no evidence that subminimum wages help people to achieve competitive employment. There's also civil rights concerns, and it contributes to the segregation of people with disabilities. And it perpetuates the thought that that people aren't capable of competitive employment, and they knew that that's not true because people who were earning subminimum wage have moved into competitive employment. Also nationally, there's been a movement to eliminate subminimum wage. And the self-advocates in Minnesota believe that it's the right thing to do to ensure their civil rights and increase their ability to earn livable wages. So in 2021, the Minnesota legislature did thoughtfully create the task force to make a plan for Minnesota in case subminimum wage is no longer allowed. So that is the work of the task force. The task force is creating a plan for how to support people with their employment goals if subminimum wages are eliminated. The legislation says that people should be supported if they choose to find competitive integrated employment, and that Minnesota should have a good plan. And they want us to have a plan so that nobody is left behind, including people with the very most significant disabilities who are using subminimum wage. The plan is also important in case the state or federal government no longer allows subminimum wages. So the task force is charged specifically with understanding the benefits of eliminating subminimum wage, finding solutions to the challenges, and engaging and educating people, supporting and figuring out what support and funding is needed, finding ways to help people with competitive employment, and then also a way to measure and track our progress. So over to Ryan.
All right, thank you, Andrea, and good afternoon, everyone. As Leah mentioned before, my name is Ryan Mers. I'm our employment coordinator at the Disability Services Division at DHS. I'm a white male. I've got short brown hair, glasses. I'm wearing a button-down short sleeve shirt, and I'm in my home office. And also very excited to be here today and to see you all continuing in this Lunch and Learn series. So for this next section, I'm going to talk about the structure of the task force, how it's conducting its work, how meetings are held, and some of the research and, initial topics that the task force is looking at. So next slide. When the legislature established the task force, the Minnesota Department of Human Services was charged with administering the task force. So really helping to put it together, convene meetings, facilitate, make sure that the task force has the supports necessary for it to do its work, access to subject matter experts, and kind of helping to facilitate that task force work. In fulfilling that role, we've contracted with the Management Analysis and Development, or MAD, division of Minnesota Management and Budget, which is sort of an in-state consulting service. So we have professional facilitators through MAD who are helping to facilitate task force meetings and do some of the administrative work around setting up work groups and stuff like that. Additionally, we also are contracting with Public Sector Consultants, or PSC, who is a consulting firm out of Michigan who's helping us to conduct engagement and communications work for the task force. So PSC's work is really important. As Matt is helping to facilitate the task force, PSC is helping to do things like interviews, focus groups, surveys, and stuff that can really help us engage the broader community and get feedback on task force work, and then use that to inform and bring back to the task force to inform the plan and the recommendations and the work occurring. So at a high level in the administration, those are sort of three groups that are helping the task force in fulfilling its duty. Next slide, please. The way that the task force is set up is that we have monthly meetings for the task force. So they're monthly 3-hour meetings. They started in February of this year, and the goal is to create a plan by this coming February. So it's basically a year of work before submitting a plan and a report to the legislature. Up on the screen here is a chart with the meetings by each month and what those meetings cover. So you can see in the first couple of months here, the February and March, the task force was really doing a lot of level setting, understanding, the topic of subminimum wages, kind of grounding work in those first months. Then as we move into April, May, June, and July, those meetings were really were where the task force was focusing on some of the specific duties outlined in the legislation or considerations that are important in developing that plan for how Minnesota, a plan for if subminimum wages are eliminated in Minnesota. So in April, it was looking at what are the benefits to eliminating subminimum wages, as well as the challenge to supporting a successful transition that a plan should address. So benefits and challenges in April. In May, we looked at the statutes, laws, rules, and policies that would be needed in Minnesota to shift away from subminimum wages. In June, the task force was looking at services and supports to help people with disabilities who are earning subminimum wages now shift away and into continue to meet their employment goals without subminimum wages. In July, the task force was taking a similar approach and looking at what are the assistance and supports that service providers would need to shift their business models and their supports away from relying on the use of subminimum wages. In August, we haven't held our August meeting yet, but we will, I believe next week, Tuesday, hold our August meeting. And at that meeting, we're going to be looking at some of the recommendations in the areas that I outlined above and getting updates from work groups on each of those areas. So maybe it's important to mention here, when the task force has had these 3-hour meetings on a monthly basis and each of these topics was brought up, those conversations were used to support and create work groups that were made up of task force members and kind of subject matter experts from different areas to really continue the task force or to build out the task force conversation during those meetings and help build recommendations and kind of do the more specifics in working to create a plan based on what the task force outlined in those meetings. So after each of these task force meetings, a work group carried on that conversation and helped build out recommendations related to those topics, which are going to start coming back to the task force in August for consideration and work and looking at how it could be put together into a plan. So that's what the meetings have looked like for the task force so far. If we could switch to the next slide. Along with holding meetings on these different topics, another area of the task force's work has been doing background research and understanding subminimum wages and what shifting away from subminimum wages can look like. So as part of that, the Management and Analysis Division, MAD, as well as DHS and public sector consultants, has been engaging with 4 states who were presented to us as model states that Minnesota might want to look at in developing our plan. So the 4 states up on the screen: Maryland, Oregon, Iowa and Ohio were states that were recommended to us through a national technical assistance firm, the State Employment Leadership Network, which is a group of state Medicaid agencies, so like DHSs and other states that get together and try to improve the way our waiver employment supports help people in getting competitive employment. So SELN recommended when we asked them about this work that really looking at and engaging with these 4 states might be beneficial in formulating our own state's plan. So the first state is Maryland, who ended the use of subminimum wages in October of 2020. The second is Oregon, who is in the process of ending their use of subminimum wages for June 2023 is their end date. And then Iowa and Ohio, who haven't eliminated subminimum wages, but have significantly reduced the use of subminimum wages in their state. So we conducted interviews with leaders and experts in those states around those initiatives to talk about what that transitions look like in each of those states. Following those interviews, that MAD Management Analysis Division also conducted background research into specific topics or areas of interest raised by each state that seemed especially important for the task force's work in Minnesota. There's a short recap from each of those conversations. I was in each of those interviews, and all of the states really mentioned the importance of certain steps in reducing or eliminating some minimum wages. And some of those steps, like providing transition resources and planning, are things that are underway in Minnesota here. So that was very encouraging to hear. And many of the representatives there also talked about some of the positive outcomes of that transition and supporting people in competitive employment. So I think they were helpful conversations, both in terms of possibility and seeing what a future could look like, and then also in terms of just understanding what that transition looked like in each state. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, following those interviews with each of the states, the Management Analysis Division did some background research and following up on topics that were raised in the conversations. Through this research, MAD has created background briefs for the task force, so kind of some research put together on different topics that will be important in the plan, including the benefits and challenges to eliminating subminimum wages, state policies that can help in a transition to competitive wages, and services and supports for workers as they shift to competitive wage employment, and then transition supports for providers. MAD is also right now working on a research brief on funding and financial support in a transition, which hopefully we'll be getting over the task force soon. So there's these, in addition to the interviews, there's also background research occurring on these different topics that is centered around the experiences of those states, as well as the broader resources that are available. Next slide, please. Earlier in the task force meeting, I mentioned a work group structure, and I want to go into, in these next couple of slides, I want to talk about what those work groups look like and how they're informing the plan and the actions of the task force. So on the screen here is sort of like a 3-box graphic that outlines how the task force and the work groups create recommendations. So first, we have task force meetings where in a task force, we're bringing in subject matter experts for the topic at hand, and those presenters are sharing information on that topic. And then public sector consultants is also taking their engagement and feedback work and consolidating the themes and what we've learned through public engagement related to that topic to bring to the task force at meetings. So we give the information to the task force at those meetings, and then task force members discuss it, express their preferences and concerns, and then use that information. And then that information gleaned during the task force is then brought over to inform the work groups. So after that task force conversation, kind of the synthesis of it is brought over to a work group of, again, task force members and subject matter experts, who are then developing specific recommendations for the plan to end the use of subminimum wages. So bringing that conversation and building out specific recommendations. And that's the process. A lot of that work is going on right now. Those work groups are meeting and putting language and doing research related to each of those recommendations. And then the work from those work groups, the outputs from them, will be going back to the task force in the next couple of meetings, where work group participants will present their recommendations to the task force, and task force members will discuss, refine, again, really figure out what recommendations and what that plan should look like. So a lot of stuff in motion right now for creating that plan. Next slide, please. On this slide is another graphic that's getting at the work group structure, as well as how ideas or recommendations for the plan are being developed. So what you see on the screen is, in the center, there's a circle that says ideas for the task force's plan. So, and then around those ideas for the task force plan is 5 boxes. And each of those boxes is a source or a way that we're getting ideas and recommendations to inform the plan that the task force is developing. You'll see 3 gray boxes, and each of those are the work groups that are meeting either right now or will be meeting. The first is like a policies work group. Second is a supports and services work group. And then the third is a measuring and monitoring progress work groups. Excuse me. Each of those work groups is meeting, developing recommendations to go into task force plans. The other 2 boxes on the screen here is illustrating that community engagement and outreach is another source or another way that we're informing the task force work, another resource. And then the last box here is benefits and challenges. I think of that as like the background research, and some of the stuff that's been done around the benefits and challenges are also feeding into ideas for the task force's plan. Next slide, please. So in these next couple of slides, I want to talk about that policy work group and that services and support work group. So the laws, rules, and up on the screen is the policy work group here. They're looking across the topic areas that we have up on the screen here, like waiver service definitions, state statutes, the role of informed choice and employment first, collaboration between agencies, and training resources and funding. So those are some of the topics that they're discussing. And this work group is looking across all these topic areas to develop recommendations about changes that are needed for mostly state level policy. And then the work group is looking at what are different ways that subminimum wages might be ended in the state, and then what changes would we need in these different areas to support a good transition. So for example, as more people begin working at competitive wages, how do we make sure that people understand the supports and services available to them, as well as the options that they have? Are there changes that we need to make in our policy to reinforce that and make sure that options are known? And are there changes to waiver services or state laws that we'll need to make if subminimum wages are ended? And then finally, the last one here, one of the other ones, collaboration between state agencies. People with disabilities get support from different public programs who are run by different state agencies at different points in their life. So how do we make sure all of these programs are working together to support people in their employment goals? And that'll be an important component of helping people transition away from the use of subminimum wages. So that's some of what the policy work group's been looking at. If we can go to the next slide. The services and supports work group is looking at what's needed for both people who are currently earning subminimum wages, as well as service provider organizations that are paying subminimum wages when the practice is ended. So it's really looking at 2 distinct tasks. Those are really kind of 2 distinct tasks, but since people are receiving their supports and services through providers, there is some intertwining of the conversations. There's some relation. The work group is looking at engagement and feedback and research to find out what's going to really help for a good transition. And the idea is that we'll have a plan that not just ends subminimum wages, which, as Andrea mentioned, is a widely used practice in Minnesota, but we'll also build a road ahead and find investments or changes that will be needed to help people meet their goals. Some of the topics that work group is discussing are up on the screen. The first, the availability of high quality employment and day supports. This is an important topic because having strong employment support set up across the state is going to be really important in helping people move to competitive wages. And then what we've also heard from our engagement and feedback work is that for some people, a paycheck isn't necessarily what's most important about the work. It's about having a meaningful role in their community and doing something that they take pride in. So how do we continue to help people meet those goals, kind of regardless of what their employment situation is, and how do we leverage our day supports to make sure that there's quality options outside of work hours? And then finally, we're doing all of this in the context of a tight labor market in Minnesota right now. And so we have historically low unemployment rates, which is an excellent opportunity across the state as we look at how do we help people with disabilities get employment, but it also means that we don't have as many direct support professionals as we need or want across the state. So how can we support people in taking advantage of these opportunities and getting what they need to be successful in employment? So that's a long explanation for looking at how do we build quality day and employment supports. Benefits planning is also a really important topic that has come up in multiple areas. So Minnesota does have some really great work incentives. How do we make sure people have access to benefits planning resources and understand how work and benefits will interact if wages go up, and what does that mean for benefits? Third, transportation availability. How do we make transportation for all of us when we're looking at employment and work as a consideration, and especially a barrier when we think about helping people with disabilities get competitively employed? So how do we make sure people have the transportation supports that they need to get to and from a job? Information and education for people and families, really, again, helping people understand options, understand the topic of subminimum wages, understand the importance of employment and life goals and what it can mean for themselves, for them, or for their loved ones. So conducting education about the topic, and then finally training and technical assistance for provider agencies. So we know technical assistance and getting trained professionals out across the state is important and will be really important in helping providers make the transition to competitive wages. So those are all topics that work group is discussing. And I think this is my last slide for this section. I know it was a lot of information, but there's a lot of work that the task force is doing, and hopefully that helps give kind of an overview of the structure and how it's set up. I now get to pass it over back to Andrea to talk about some of the engagement work of the task force.
All right. Thanks, Ryan. So one of the charges that the task force is tackling is community engagement and outreach, so that the task force is able to get input from anybody who is wanting to participate in any of the engagement activities that we have, so that we can get a wide variety of perspectives. So in terms of the engagement activities timeline, we have held a listening session in May, interviews that have been going on May through August, focused small group conversations that have been happening over the summer, a survey that is open now, and then there'll be more community forums held in September and October. So next slide, just to get a little bit deeper into the engagement activity that we've done to date. Like I said, there are several ways that the task force has been engaging community members so far. So there have been interviews, small group discussions, listening sessions, surveys. There have been 9 interviews with state and local federal agencies, advocacy organizations, providers, and families of people with disabilities. There's also been a couple of small group discussions with both advocacy organizations and case managers at the local level. And there are more engagement sessions planned over the next few months. Next slide. The task force hosted a listening session, and there were 120 people who attended. And it was very well represented by various stakeholder groups, although the number of self-advocates was very low, which is something that needs to be addressed. The task force really needs to hear directly from people with disabilities themselves about you know, and that's especially important because the feedback that they give is often quite different than what we hear from other stakeholders. Finally, there is a survey that's open now until August 7th. There have been 300 responses so far across that same variety of stakeholder groups. So the task force really encourages everybody to fill that out and spread the word about it. Next slide. In terms of the feedback that we've heard, the themes from the engagement activities are summarized here on this slide. So the first is, of course, that change can be hard. And so how do we work together to really make sure that everybody is able to, you know, understand what's happening and come along together. Another theme is around communication. Particularly, there needs to be better communication about available services. One of the things that I think we've heard the most is that people think that subminimum wage is their only option because they haven't been offered or told about other options. You know, as we have kind of more of a one-size-fits-all model, and we've historically that's what we've had. So that's really all people know about. So much higher level of information is needed for people to base their decisions on. Another theme is ensuring equitable access to services. So, you know, the dominant culture who built these existing models really was the white, middle, and upper middle class. And they're the ones who are using them the most. So a lot of the feedback has said that we need to ensure that services and supports are co-created with people with disabilities and work for everybody and all people going forward so that there's equitable access to those services. Another theme is to consider the direct support workforce strategies. We've had a system that currently is very heavily dependent on paid staff. And we, you know, are seeing now that that isn't sustainable long-term. There aren't enough working age adults in Minnesota to fill all of the jobs that we currently have open. So there needs to be a concerted effort to figure out additional ways to support people going forward. Another theme is that the system is heavily reliant on case management and being able to provide information and authorized services and all, as we know, all industries are currently being affected by workforce issues. So there needs to be also ways to streamline the process, knowing that that's our new normal going forward, the processes of providing information and authorizing services. Another theme is to make sure that public transportation is available, reliable, and accessible in all areas of the state. And finally, that there needs to also be an emphasis on meaningful day support services for those who do not move into community jobs. Another thing that we have heard quite a bit is this sentiment that what will happen for people who have very significant support needs. And so that's just another thing that the task force is working to address. Next slide. Continuing some of the themes that we've heard. In order to do this work well, there needs to be a significant culture shift. There needs to be a concerted effort to raise expectations related to people with disabilities and promote their strength, wisdom, capacity, and resiliency. Employers need to be educated about hiring people with disabilities. They need employees now more than ever, but why would they hire people they think are weak and needy and vulnerable and incapable? That narrative that we've used to secure funding and services has really perpetuated that negative narrative about people with disabilities to employers. And so that needs to be addressed. Also, how people with disabilities are portrayed to communities in general. Another theme is around improving consistency and transition from school to competitive employment, improving coordination between voc rehab services and waiver case managers, providing training for case managers to support transitions to competitive employment is another thing that has bubbled up quite a bit. So those are some of the main themes that we have heard as we've summarized all of the feedback that we've received. And those are things that the task force will be working to address and incorporate into the plan that they submit to the legislature next February. So back to Ryan.
All right, thanks, Andrea. I get to lead us through the next couple of sections. And the first one is what's ahead. So we've talked about the work that the task force has done and the engagement activities. I'm going to spend a couple slides here just talking about what you can look for in the coming months from the task force. So next slide, please. All right. The big charge in front of the task force and the responsibility that the legislature has set up the task force to do is to submit a plan for how Minnesota can end the use of subminimum wages to the legislature by February 15th of 2023. So that's really the date that we're pushing against and looking for to develop that plan and figure out what's the best plan for us as a state if subminimum wages are eliminated and get that over to the legislature by February. In order to achieve that goal in the coming months, we're going to be bringing recommendations from the work group to the task force for consideration. So hopefully we're moving a little bit from the learning to helping to pull everything together and develop draft reports. A remaining duty that we have in the legislation for the task force that we need to begin putting more effort and work towards is developing a plan to monitor state progress and track outcomes when eliminating subminimum wages. So the legislature also wants us to look at how can we have a way to track the progress that the state would be making in ending the use of subminimum wages, as well as a plan for how we're going to look at the outcomes for people with disabilities. Are we seeing people getting more competitive employment? How are we looking at outcomes and tracking that in the transition? So we'll be diving into that work in the coming months. And then finally, a sort of final responsibility that we'll be providing in that plan and recommendation is to give the legislature a recommendation on continuing the task force beyond its scheduled expiration. So as part of our plan, recommending does the task force need to continue meeting and doing work. So that's a quick summary of some of the major tasks ahead of the task force. If we can move to the next slide. Andrea mentioned in the engagement in describing the engagement work of the task force that there is a survey that we've already gotten 300 responses for. And I wanted to highlight that survey here on the screen. I believe you can access it from the task force website, and it's also hyperlinked in the slides here. But this is a survey and it's open for responses through August 7th. So I think that's through the remainder of this week. So before Sunday, got to get your responses in before Sunday, but this is a really great opportunity. We want to hear ideas about what people with disabilities, their families, and people who serve them would need if subminimum wages end in Minnesota. And the survey will be really helpful in understanding that feedback and bringing it into task force work. So just encouraging people to fill out that survey. Next slide. All right. The next section here is we got a couple of questions. I know when the OIO does registration for this event, I think they did like a call for if there's any questions related or to the topic of the presentation. And we got 2 questions ahead of time that which is really helpful. It's really nice to be able to see questions and develop a response. And so wanted to go through those 2 questions that we received through the OIO help forward to us. Next slide. The first question is, what is planned for people that need adaptation and support in their employment? How will we make sure that they are included during an end to subminimum wages? So this question, I think, is really related to what Andrea was saying earlier, where people with significant support needs, who might need changes in their work environment and support during employment, how are we going to make sure that they're included and not sort of left behind in a transition away from some minimum wages? And one of the reasons it is important for the task force to develop a plan for if subminimum wages are eliminated, is to make sure that the transition is inclusive of everyone, regardless of their disability. The recommendations that are being developed by the task force will include investments needed to address the support needs of people with significant disabilities. These recommendations, as I was mentioning earlier, may include things like expanding supported employment or customized employment, where job developers work with employers and people to tailor jobs to people's specific skills and have job coaching supports available to help people be successful at their job. So I think to make sure that people are included and that we are building kind of that better future, really being planful and developing, identifying what supports are needed as part of the work of that task force. And hopefully some of the information that we presented today will help kind of build that picture of how it might start to look. Next slide, please. The next question was, my daughter has multiple disabilities, wants to work, but works very slowly even with a job coach. How can we expect an employer to pay her minimum wage with her low productivity? And I think as I mentioned in the previous response, the work of the task force in developing a plan and identifying transition supports is going to be important in helping people like your daughter successfully move to competitive wages. But really, to more directly respond to what I think this question is raising is, what could that look like, or what can we do? And I think talking with your daughter's case manager and current employment service provider about their job development supports might be really beneficial. Good job development professionals are able to work with people and employers in their community to identify a person's strengths and then match it to an employer's specific needs. So while your daughter might work more slowly than other people, she also has unique abilities that employers and maybe even your own daughter doesn't know about. So a competitive job might look, pretty different than the work she's doing right now, or the work someone's doing right now at subminimum wages. But along with that change, the definition of productivity could also change. And, as a sort of another note here in thinking about this is, we have countless stories across the country of people with significant disabilities who were previously determined like not employable and have gone on to succeed in competitive employment. And what we hear from employers is they're often talking about strengths like reliability and the enthusiasm of people. And at this point in time, they might also be especially open to hiring with our current labor market. But a final note that we also hear from businesses, or that we've heard from other states, is profit's obviously important to businesses, but it's also important to them to be a valued member of their community, especially for those smaller businesses, which oftentimes end up being really good employment fits for people because they're more able and willing to customize employment settings. And so really tapping into businesses and their role in the community and supporting people can be helpful. And I think, again, really tying all this back into working with job developers, requesting those supports and making sure they're available, and using strategies like customized employment can be really helpful in building out, how can we move to competitive wages? So those were the two questions on the responses. I know, I think that's it for the questions section. I've seen a couple things come in the chat, but I don't know. I've been talking, so I haven't had time to look at them. So maybe I'll go through kind of I'll move on to our closing stuff and do just talk about our next lunch and learn, and then maybe we can circle back. If Andrea, I don't know if you've had time to look at the chat, or if there's anything that you would want to jump in, or if it's stuff that we should save, or I just haven't had a chance to read them yet. If we can go to the next slide. All right, we're going to be having another lunch and learn about the work on the task force on eliminating subminimum wages on Wednesday, September 28th from 12 to 1 p.m. And this is a lunch and learn that the OIO graciously invited us back, or said we could join, because we've heard a lot about wanting to hear that experience of people in competitive employment and what employment has looked like for different people with disabilities in the state. So we're seeing how we can best address that. Like, what does this employment look like? And we're thinking organizing a panel discussion to share people's employment experiences might be really helpful. So just mark that date. We're going to be excited to come back and join you for a fourth lunch and learn. Maybe before turning it over, Andrea, is there anything in the chat that would be good for us to address?
Yeah, there's a couple questions. So one of them is around what if somebody wants to continue working at their DTH provider? And so I think, just for purposes of what the task force has been tasked with by the legislature, it has nothing to do with ending employment by service providers. It's really just looking at subminimum wages. So providers are still would still be, conceivably able to provide services. They just wouldn't be able to pay people subminimum wage. And there have been several successful examples of providers in Minnesota who have transitioned away from using subminimum wage and have been able to successfully continue to support people with very significant disabilities and remain open and remain viable. Part of the legislation that appropriated the task force also appropriated significant funding for providers to receive technical assistance. I think sometimes it's hard for providers to sort of get their head around how they would be able to be viable with a different business model that didn't include paying subminimum wages. And so there's really good opportunities out there right now to get some really good technical assistance to support providers who are interested in making that transition. And then the other question is really around the lack of services in more remote areas and community-based options. And so that's one of the things that I think Ryan went through when he was talking about the services and supports work group, that group is really looking at in terms of their recommendations and ensuring that there are viable resources, services, and supports available across the state in the event of a elimination of subminimum wage. So that's what I have. Ryan, back to you.
Yeah, I got one more question that I saw come in to me, but maybe to build off a little bit of what you were saying, Andrea, around those transition supports and rural communities or greater Minnesota. Just a note, we're going to be having an e-list come out from DHS in a couple of days announcing some of the awardees in the Provider Reinvention Grant Program, those transition resources that Andrea was noted. And there's some providers in greater Minnesota, smaller providers, who have really stepped up and kind of taken leadership here and said, we want to get technical assistance and we want to move our organization towards competitive wages and ending 14C. And I'm really inspired and hopeful that the work of those providers will really help us understand what that looks like and kind of build a path and a model that other service providers can look at. So look for that e-list coming out, but there's, I think there's some promising work that's being done under those transition resources and that provider reinvention grant. So those are good things to pay attention to. And the next one, the next question I got or that I see is, what is a plan to engage employers as well as HR departments, like in business trainers? And this is a great question. And it's one that I've heard a lot. And I think the most important, certainly from my perspective, when looking at how do you engage employers in this work and how do we help create that culture shift, I think the role of those job developers that I was mentioning, or those service providers in a person's local area, really engaging with employers on an individual basis and based on a person's need. I think that's the best way to help employers understand the benefits that someone brings and the opportunities. And, I think that's an important part of the strategy and employer engagement. Also, when we look at how do we engage the broader business community, some of the work of the workforce development division of the Department of Employment and Economic Development at the state level, DEED does employer engagement and works, not only for people with disabilities, but also for other workforce groups or other populations, helps engage with employers. So that's another good, that's a state level strategy. But I really do think that individual engagement at the community level is so important in helping businesses understand the benefits. And then, there's also colleges are mentioned there. And I think that's a really important when we look at that broader change. How do we make sure the narratives and what we're teaching, professionals, case managers, voc rehab counselors, direct support professionals, all of us across the state, and understanding like how we help people meet their goals, and really aligning that to understanding the possibilities with employment and what that means for people is important, and I think will help contribute to that. So it's a well-received note on looking at colleges and trainers at that level. I think those are the questions. I also see one more. Sorry, I know we got just a couple more minutes, so I'm going through my chats and I'm trying to go through them. But I saw another note about places like Target and Walmart might not be the best environments for people with disabilities, like those big employers and those big spaces. And if that's the strategy, is just moving people into jobs at Target or Walmart, for some people, that's not going to be the right approach, and that's not going to be what they need. And I think that's it's an important comment, and it's an important question for how that looks. I do think we know, and I hear a lot from, again, different job developers in this state and other states, that sometimes there's a lot of advantages with smaller businesses. They might be smaller, they might not have the resources that a Target or a Walmart has, but they're often more willing to kind of work and customize, and it might be an environment where someone can kind of figure out their unique interest and have that role in their community. So I think looking at small businesses is really important. For organizations like Target or Walmart, those are good opportunities for some people, right? Not everyone, but some people, that might really be the job that brings value to them. And I think I don't know those companies specifically, but I know bigger organizations have initiatives to have inclusive environments. So, I don't think there's one type of competitive employment or one employer that's right for everyone. I do think it is looking like at each person, what are their strengths, what do they bring, and then how do we figure out how do we help them, build on those strengths and find something that's meaningful in their lives where they're contributing and finding value with it. So I think with 5 minutes left, I think I might pass it over back to Leah. I'm seeing everything. I think I got through everything I saw in my chat. I think I'll pass it back over to Leah if there's any other closing stuff that we want to handle from that end.
Thank you, Ryan and Andrea, both for speaking today. We can go to the next slide. We just want to thank everybody for joining our conversation today. And I do want to remind people, Ryan did say that the survey is open until August 7th. So please go out and take that. Also reminding people to please sign up for other events like this on the Olmstead Implementation Office website. You can also sign up there to receive their newsletter and notifications of other types of events. You can see the different work groups that they have going on and learn all kinds of information there. So please sign up for information if you're interested. Don't forget to register for the September Lunch and Learn event, so you can come back and hear the fourth in the series from Ryan and Andrea. Ryan and Andrea, again, thank you so much. You can see their emails here on the screen. So it's andreazuber@arcminnesota.org and ryan.mers@state.mn.us if you would like to contact them directly. But from me and everybody at the Olmstead Implementation Office, thank you very much for joining us today, and have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.